Hi, everybody. My name is Julie Milton, and I'm COSSA's Director of Public Affairs, and welcome to COSSA Headlines for March. So for those who haven't joined this series before, we'll start with about 15 minutes to go over the past month's most important social science news. And then we'll turn it over to our deep dive discussion. And this month, we're really excited to be joined by Matt Owens, who's the Vice President for Federal Relations at AAU, and Bethany Johns, who's the Director of Research Policy at APLU. And they'll be talking to us about COVID relief for researchers and the RISE Act. And so that should be a really interesting discussion, particularly after the passage of the COVID relief bill, which we'll talk about shortly. And then we'll end, as we always do, with some homework, stuff that you can do in the next month to support social science. Okay, so as I was saying, yesterday Congress passed the American Rescue Plan, which is a massive relief bill that aims to bring financial support to those affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. And President Biden is expected to sign it tomorrow. The package is $1.9 trillion, and it primarily includes payments for individuals, extensions of unemployment benefits, and aid to state and local governments, along with a lot of other provisions intended to provide relief to individuals and families. But within that is also a few provisions of interest to the research community. First of all, there's $39.9 billion in funding for colleges and universities. Similar to the CARES Act, one of the relief bills passed last year, half of that should be used for student aid. There's also $100 million for the Institute of Education Sciences at the Department of Education, and that will be used for research related to addressing learning loss caused by the pandemic among K through 12 students. And there's $600 million for the National Science Foundation, and that funding will be used to fund or extend new and existing research grants, cooperative agreements, scholarship, fellowships, and apprenticeships, and related administrative expenses to prevent, prepare for, and respond to coronavirus. So to clarify, that is funding for research about the pandemic. What this funding is not to be used for, and our deep dive speakers will get into it in more detail, is to support researchers whose livelihoods, labs, studies have been interrupted by the pandemic, if they're not researching COVID specifically. Still, we're excited about the $600 million for NSF. Similar funding passed in an earlier relief bill, and a bunch of those grants ended up going to social scientists. I know we heard that they were, I think, among the most successful of the research directorates in terms of those COVID research dollars. So the House Science Committee has been really busy. They finally announced their membership roster for this Congress, sort of just about last. As we've talked about in the past, the chair and ranking member have not changed. It's Representative Eddie Bernice Johnson, who is the chairwoman, and Representative Frank Lucas, who is the ranking member. There are a few new Democratic subcommittee chairs. Jamal Brown from New York is in charge of the Subcommittee on Energy, and Don Beyer from Virginia is leading the Space and Aeronautics Subcommittee. New Republican ranking members include Stephanie Bice as the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Environment, Jay Obernolte as ranking member of the Subcommittee on Investigations and Oversight, and Representative Michael Waltz as the ranking member on the Research and Technology Subcommittee. So those are new names to the committee, and COSSA will be doing our usual outreach to all of these offices. So you should start hearing their names soon. So once all the members were named, the Science Committee has been busy having a lot of hearings. There was one that was really notable for our community on February 25th called Building Back the U.S. Research Enterprise, COVID Impacts and Recovery. Witnesses to that one included COSSA board member and American Educational Research Association Executive Director Felice Levine and AAAS CEO Sudip Parikh. That hearing covered a lot of the issues that our deep dive speakers are going to talk about with the RISE Act, as well as the Supporting Early Career Researchers Act, which is intended to help offset the pandemic's impact on younger investigators. They also held a hearing on the science of COVID-19 vaccines and encouraging vaccine uptake on February 19th. That was another one that was heavy on the social science content. NIH has released a new request for information. This is part of a new diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative called UNITE. UNITE is an acronym, and each letter stands for a subcommittee. The subcommittees are basically, they take members from across the ICs, and they each focus on a different aspect or a different objective to address. So there's U, which is understanding stakeholder experiences through listening and learning. N, new research on health disparities, minority health, and health equity. I, improving the NIH culture and structure for equity, inclusion, and excellence. T, transparency, communication, and accountability with NIH's internal and external stakeholders. And E, extramural research ecosystem. So the RFI is specifically seeking input on approaches to advance racial diversity, equity, and inclusion in the biomedical research enterprise, and expanding research on health disparities and health equity. NIH is seeking comments to the RFI through April 9th. We've linked to the UNITE initiative on the screen, and you'll be able to find the link to the RFI. Sort of related to this is a report that the Advisory Committee to the Directors Working Group on Diversity produced and presented at the most recent ACD meeting, and that report on racism in science basically, covered, it basically covered the ACD's work towards that issue and sort of complements the UNITE initiative. So that is also available on the COSSA website. There's a new NSF program within the Understanding the Rules of Life Big Idea. So Understanding the Rules of Life Emergent Network seeks to support convergence research related to the rules of emergence for networks of living systems and their environments. And that includes interaction among organisms, environmental, social, and human engineered systems. So it's sort of, I think it's led by the biology directorate, but it incorporates all like social systems as well. And so social scientists are encouraged to apply. The deadline for proposals to that is May 20th. The National Academies has a new program called the Cohort of New Voices Initiative. It's a 2-year program giving leadership opportunities to a diverse group of mid-career experts to collaborate and develop interdisciplinary solutions to complex problems. And the New Voices Initiative is open to US-based scientists, engineers, health professionals, and other experts from all professional sectors, including industry, academia, nonprofits, and the public sector. People can apply through March 31st, and the link is on the screen. Another National Academies initiative is the Action Collaborative on Preventing Sexual Harassment in Higher Education. And they have launched what they're calling a partner network to sort of expand the range of organizations that are involved in this effort. The partners will commit to, The collaborative was created to facilitate the work of higher education institutions in developing and implementing efforts that move beyond basic legal compliance to evidence-based policies and practices for preventing sexual harassment. There's already 60 colleges who are part of the overall initiative, and the partner network is going to engage other types of organizations, as I said, and there are 13 initial organizations. So more information about both the overall network, the overall collaborative, and the new partner network is on the National Academies website. SEAN, which is the Societal Action Network, Societal Experts Action Network, which is a product of the National Academies has released 2 new sets of expert guidance related to COVID-19. The first one is on emergency evacuation and sheltering during the COVID-19 pandemic, and that sort of gives communities guidelines on how to prepare for and plan for disasters. And the second is building confidence in the COVID-19 vaccine, and that is really helpful and has some specific strategies for public engagement to combat mistrust and to build confidence, and communication strategies for promoting vaccine acceptance. Both of those sets of guidance are available on the National Academy's website. Bringing it back to COSSA, we've just opened registration for 2021's Virtual Social Science Advocacy Day, which is really exciting. We sort of had to go virtual last year, and so now that we know what we're doing, we're going to build on that experience and hopefully have a really big group of advocates. Registration is only $25 this year, and so we've had to cap the number of slots available. So I would encourage you to register sooner rather than later. As a reminder, Advocacy Day is open to individuals affiliated with COSSA member organizations, and more information is on our website. And lastly, our latest Why Social Science post came from AAA, the American Anthropological Association, and they highlighted Anthropology Day, which is their annual holiday every February to celebrate anthropology and share the discipline with the public. Okay, so now I'm really excited to turn it over to our guest speakers. Matt Owens is the Executive Vice President and Vice President for Federal Relations at the Association of American Universities, AAU, where he's been since 2002. He oversees AAU's federal relations activities and has been primarily responsible for overall federal budget and appropriations advocacy. Dr. Bethany Johns is the Director of Research Policy at the Association of Public and Land Grant Universities, or APLU, where she works on research policy and regulatory issues related to sustaining the excellence of public research universities and staffs their Council on Research. I'm going to let the two of them kick it off, and I will take the screen share down so you can see their faces.
Okay, thanks for the introduction, and thank you for inviting us here today. The RISE Act, we've been asked to go into a deep dive. Be careful what you ask for. We're prepared, so please, if you have any questions, we welcome those. We're all savvy now with how we do virtual meetings, so we can look at the chats as well if you have those sidebar conversations. How we have structured today is to talk about a little bit of the history and the justification of the RISE Act, definitely also keeping in mind your advocacy days that you have coming up. And Matt will talk specifically about some of our political strategy and where we are now. It was already mentioned that Biden will be signing something very important today. So Matt can also touch on those aspects as well. Matt, do you just want to do a few minutes before we deep dive? Say hello.
Yeah, no, much appreciated for this invitation. We look forward to this discussion. And like I said, Bethany's going to tee us up with a little bit of history of how we got to where we got to. And then I'll dig in a little bit where we are and where we're going. And we definitely like to speak with you about what's resonating on the Hill and the administration for this type of significant investment to shore up our nation's research enterprise. So.
Yeah, well, the start of this legislation started at the very beginning of the pandemic. We were both, Matt and I recall very clearly, we were at a meeting at Vanderbilt University when we finally got the message that campuses were closing. There was going to be a nationwide social distancing effort. And that was about the end or mid-March. And then traveling home and experiencing the flights of everybody wearing masks suddenly and no hand sanitizer anywhere in the airports. It was a very surreal experience. But we kicked into high gear basically at that moment, as I remember it. And within the APLU, the Association of Public Land Grant Universities, our Council on Research really started the process of understanding what the impact would be. So way back a year ago, about this time almost exactly, we started thinking about what does it mean for research labs, what does it mean for research students, and what does it mean for research faculty, and how we are going to be social distanced. How are we still going to do our research? How do we transition to doing everything online? How do we handle plans in which we may or may not come back to campus? I don't know if you remember, but back a year ago, we were like, oh, just 3 to 4 months, it's only going to last that long. So campuses weren't necessarily thinking yet years in advance, but they had an understanding that this epidemic could really be long term. So we had back in April and May at APLU these webinars where we talked about ramp up and recovery plans for universities and university labs. What does it mean? And then really honing in down on what are going to be the costs? What are the impacts that we need to ask Congress for? Where are universities going to really be hurting when it comes to the impacts of COVID? And I can share that link to those public presentations we've posted online. So about the April timeframe, we began all of our communications with the House and the Senate leadership on this conversation on research relief and the funding that we would need as part of any of the bills that would come out from Congress on what would be necessary for the universities to sustain our research enterprise, especially as with public universities, we care as part of our mission very deeply that impact with our communities and our impact on the nation with trying to find a solution to the pandemic and researching vaccines and possible testing methods. So most of the labs and facilities transitioned very quickly into dealing with the pandemic in some way. There are some vet schools that completely switched from doing animal research to doing COVID testing and COVID research because they had the facilities available and already certified, and so they were able to quickly make those changes. But that comes at a cost. It's not, it's difficult to understand still some of the costs of what that really was impacted. And then about the May timeframe, we got our first draft of the RISE Act put together, and really want to give credit to the UC system, the University of California system, and others that really started the conversation and working with the university systems, including AAU and APLU, to think through what it is we really needed to ask Congress for. So around the May timeframe is when we had something on paper that was called the RISE Act, or what we were calling the RISE Act still at the time. Wasn't yet officially introduced into Congress. But one of the questions we had to ask is, what are we saying we actually need? And we knew at that time that estimating the costs of COVID would be still very difficult, even though universities were using their accounting systems very savvy and making sure that they accounted for every dollar that was related to COVID impacts. It was all accounted for. It was still hard to estimate what's really going to be the impact. So as we were thinking it through, we realized, well, we can do our best estimate using what is currently already public data for R&D spending. So for the most recent R&D spending data, we were able to estimate about a 3 to 4 month significant impact, which Julia had mentioned, interrupted research. I like the word interrupted, that was interesting. That this would have a significant impact on those who, again, had to pivot their research to doing something COVID related, or pivot completely to thinking new ways of doing research in order to try to complete their research. Some graduate students, of course, may not have access to what they needed to do, whether it was in the labs or field work or travel. You know, lots of plans just got interrupted. So we estimated a few numbers that we thought were good for each of the science agencies. And I believe for COSSA, some of the science agencies that you care the most about are NIH and NSF. So when we sent in our requests, our ask, we asked for $10 billion for NIH and $3 billion for the National Science Foundation. And so $3 billion, if you follow I'm just going to use NSF as an example. If you follow what the current budget is for NSF, it's approximately a third of the total budget for NSF that we were asking for in research relief. And that's significant because it's basically, if you've got an NSF grant and you've got like the 3-year cycle grants, then you're basically asking, I need just a few more months, maybe 6 months of an extension just to complete what I had hoped to complete, what I had promised in my proposal that was accepted by NSF 3 years ago. I just need a little bit more time to finish it up. So that's how we were mainly thinking about the money that we were putting in the bill and asking for RISE. And you can also go into all of our AAU and APLU websites and search RISE Act and find more details about all the agencies and our letters that we've written to members of Congress if you want more information on that specifically. So we also got, we just want to emphasize that these are our best estimates on what we think the agencies need to fund the researchers that have been interrupted by COVID. And we have not received any official confirmation from the agencies saying that these numbers A-okay, but we have gotten like the wink, wink, nudge, nudge. You're in the right ballpark. Thank you for your work that you're doing. So the agencies have confirmed in one way or another that these are important numbers and pertinent to continue to ask for. So then in June was when we sort of officially got it off and introduced into the House. And we also had a companion bill in the Senate. It was at the end of June timeframe. And again, special thanks to the University of California system, University of Michigan, and Colorado. Their representatives and their work, their government relations directors had really did a lot of work trying to push this through. Representative DeGette from Colorado and Representative Upton from Michigan have really led this effort for quite a while, including while in the new Congress, and Matt will speak more directly to that. And at that time, we also asked for co-sponsors or endorsers of the RISE Act, and COSSA, thank you. You signed on. So we really do appreciate that. I think in the end, Matt, you can correct me if I'm wrong, we had around 300 or more organizations who endorsed the RISE Act. And we do hope that you will use this information as part of your advocacy. We're still fighting for it. And again, Matt will talk more details on the continued fight. Now, one special note I wanted to mention, and this relates directly to hopefully your advocacy you'll do in the coming month or so. You may hit an interesting question from conservative members who ask, why should taxpayers pay researchers when campuses are closed and productivity has decreased or stopped? We've heard this question from more conservative, fiscal conservative members on the House and on the Senate side. And what we want to emphasize is that as you tell your personal story about the impacts that COVID has had on you and your research, that just because you couldn't get to the lab, you couldn't get to the field, you couldn't travel to where you needed to travel, or you couldn't do your in-person clinical work, that does not mean you were not productive. So I want to make sure that you just take that word out of your vocabulary completely. As a scientist, I don't think you've ever had a non-productive day. Like our minds are going constantly, thinking of new problems, new challenges, new solutions. And every scientist who's been impacted by COVID has thought of new ways to try to think through of finishing their research and their work and doing it in new and innovative ways. The silver lining in this is that we're thinking new ways of doing things we've never thought before and how we actually try to accomplish our work remotely. So I want to make sure that you talk about that even though you may not be where you thought you would be when you originally got your grant, you may have thought you'd be physically in a lab. That does not mean you're not productive. So when we talk about the impacts, we usually use the term research output. And there's a great paper that I'll again put in the chat where it talks about research output in terms of what was unaddressed or uninterrupted. And this could be like, again, what you thought you would do but couldn't do because you pivoted maybe to tackling COVID-related research. Like you had to just transition your office completely because you wanted to participate in what the nation was doing to solve the crisis. So lots of information we can provide on that. And I'll hand it over to Matt and start entering in a lot of things in the chat.
Thanks, Bethany. And thank you all again for inviting us to talk with you here today. And thank you also. Well, I know many of you have been active in helping to advocate for the RISE Act and the need for this type of infusion of funds to shore up the research enterprise and the work all of you do. So let me start with, we have a lot of momentum. And frankly, while it's been a year in this pandemic, and as Bethany articulated, we've been working on this almost from the very get-go because we understood very quickly there were going to be significant ramifications and harmful impacts to the research you all do and others do across the country. I actually just looked it up while Bethany was speaking. The first letter that AAU, APLU, AAMC, and the American Council on Education sent was dated March 19th, 2020, where at that point, we're barely into this pandemic, but we're already hearing the reports from researchers in our campuses, how devastating this is going to be. The fact that we would lose cell lines and other cultures, that those of you who do field work and engaged in the social sciences, you're not going to be able to do this. And you didn't know for how long. We were at that point estimating about $13 billion. And here we are a year later, and as Bethany described, we had to change that estimate, and we've been able to enshrine that estimate in the RISE Act. So one of the things we thought might be helpful for all of you is that, well, we've got all this momentum. It really, what we're trying to do now is get over this finish line, what does feel like a marathon. And let me talk a little bit about how we got some of that political support. We started with the House Science Committee. There was a roundtable that they held not too long after the pandemic started. And when AAU and APLU and the others sent a letter on March 19th to really figure out what is going on, what are going to be the impacts, and how are we going to bridge what we need to keep research going. And then the situation, as I said, it really worsened quickly. And we started to understand that this isn't a 1-2 month problem. This is looking like a 6, month, maybe even more. Again, no one really quite understood the depth of the pandemic at that point. And from there, what really, again, started to generate that political support were the efforts by researchers and students and universities starting to tell their stories that now my dissertation is going to be delayed. I'm going to have to extend my graduation date. I'm not able to do the research in my laboratory at this point, or I can't go out into the field. And of course, well, we know essential research continued, especially that on COVID-19 itself. And we did a lot of repurposing, as Bethany has said. Lots of research, as we know, couldn't continue because we just didn't simply have the PPE, the configurations of the laboratories. And while we've been able to restart and get most of that going, there are still big impacts to this day. Another thing that's been able to, after we tell those stories early on and continuing, is that we've seen a number of studies and reports about how science has impacted. The National Academies has done some work in this end. There have been numerous articles in Science, Ithaca, and so forth that are really showing the impacts on the people and their ability to do this research, and how their careers have been significantly affected. So whether it's individuals who again have primary caretaking responsibilities for their children or their parents or others, they've been severely impacted by all of this, and their ability to advance their science has been impacted as well. And while they're, again, remaining productive and there are still many outputs, we're just still not in the same place that we were. So one of the challenges is, and we were able to address this fast, is we got the administrative flexibility from the federal agencies and OSTP to keep people paid and as productive as possible and continue to put outputs under the circumstances they were in. But that helped put out the immediate fire early in the pandemic. But frankly, there's a slow burn as this pandemic has continued, and it still continues. That administrative flexibilities just aren't going to put that out. Funding is needed to put out that fire as more and more time passes. And that's what the RISE Act is meant to do. So again, we're still enjoying some of those administrative flexibilities. We need as much of that as possible so that, again, we didn't see people fall off the payroll and we can continue to support them. But that's a Band-Aid, so to speak, in this period of time. So there's another aspect of why the RISE Act has been enjoying some political support, and that's that we're at a critical moment for research, innovation, and our economic competitiveness. And this concerns about other nations, particularly China, as it relates to both our economic and national security. So Democrats and Republicans alike, they understand that federal investments in science are critical to going forward. And if we don't shore up federally supported science and research soon, future federal funding for research will force really, really difficult decisions about whether to support existing research projects and personnel and traineeships, and doing so at the expense of new research projects and traineeships and fellowships. This is not how we advance our nation's research enterprise. And again, that's why we're seeing this support. Last year, we had a little over 150 co-sponsors of both the House and Senate versions of the RISE Act. I just heard earlier today we just have a little over 120 new co-sponsors in the House measure, and the Senate's taking a little more deliberate approach, and we're expecting more sponsors soon. They came out the door with, I believe it was 4 co-sponsors. So we anticipate building, and we need your help to build that support. And they're buoyed by the fact that, as Bethany said, we have over 320 national organizations and universities that have support. We're talking about industry associations and individual companies. We're talking about organizations like COSSA and AAU and APLU, to our member universities, chambers of commerce, many scientific societies, all have done that. And that has helped demonstrate why there's a strong political support going forward to do that. But something really important to remember about the RISE Act. The RISE Act is an authorization bill. It's not an appropriations bill. And many of you probably know the difference, but I'm going to just do a recap on this because it's really, really important. What RISE does is say, here's the amount of funding that's necessary for each of the federal agencies to solve this problem. So it points out the budget, but it doesn't give you the actual dollars. The RISE Act has always been what's often called is a marker, right? It's a way to generate political support to get across the finish line, to actually secure actual research spending. So if the RISE Act were to clear both chambers of Congress and the president were to sign it into law, it'd be it'd be wonderful. We're sending the right message, but it doesn't mean a single dollar will be delivered to any of those agencies, because then they have to go appropriate that. So what we're trying to do is build the political support around the RISE Act so that its provisions can be included in any legislation that moves forward with real funding to accomplish the ends of the RISE Act. So we build the political support through this authorization mechanism, legislation, and then we look for the right vehicle to do that, which brings us to today and where we are. And that is, as was mentioned earlier, the president is signing, I think he actually just signed not too long ago, the American Rescue Plan. Okay. Next on the horizon is what's often being called to, though not officially, an American Recovery Act. And that is meant, as you've probably been reading, to really put us in that sort of build back better agenda that the president is trying to advance, where we're trying to make sure that we have the economic strength and the wherewithal to benefit all Americans and address big problems such as the climate and climate change, right? To bolster our infrastructure, to take care of other things that make us better as a society. Well, research has an opportunity to fund it. The RISE Act has an opportunity, and that's where we're spending a lot of time and effort, and why we need, again, to continue to build support for the RISE Act. Part of a Build Back Better plan, part of recovery is making sure research recovers all that it has lost, so then we can continue then to build on that in a trajectory that sustains increased funding for all of these, so that we can have the discoveries, the science we need for the innovations to create those new industries, create new jobs, make us more economically competitive, and frankly have the technologies we need for security purposes as well. That's part of this, and that's where you may be reading already that Senator Schumer, Majority Leader in the Senate, he's announced that he's looking at comprehensive legislation that it's designed in some ways, to use his words, outcompete China. Right? There's security concerns associated with that. Part of that is talk about the Endless Frontiers Act, which was introduced in the last Congress, all about strengthening our research capacities and taking advantage of that. Well, this is where a RISE Act can also potentially fit in, if that's the pathway for a Recovery Act to take care of it there. Of course, there's also the FY22 appropriations. We have not seen the president's budget. We expect to see that either late this month in March, or it could go all the way into April or May. So we're waiting. We expect a small or so-called skinny budget, give sort of top line outlines, and then a more detailed budget to follow later. So more on that, but there may be ways to address what we need in terms of research recovery or relief through the president's budget, and we'll be looking for those signs as well. I think the last thing I'll talk about now, before we want to open up to your questions and a discussion, is where we're focused. So again, number one, continue to build political support, get more co-sponsors in the House and the Senate, Republican and Democrat, to demonstrate that support. Two, we're of course communicating with the administration and offices like the Office of Science and Technology Policy, the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, and the National Economic Council, and others who are thinking in these terms and trying to shape the administration's recovery plan, whatever it will be named, to include where research fits into this, especially this research recovery. And some of the things that I think are really important in the messaging in all of this is that, to Bethany's earlier point, is telling those stories. Policymakers need to clearly understand what have been the strains on the researchers, and we've seen so much of this, I mentioned earlier, and the extra burdens that have been put on early career scientists. This really resonates with a lot, because it's operational. And so we're looking for those stories and telling them, and thinking how you aggregate that and to make sure that the impact is clear. And we know this is working because there's legislation called Supporting Early Career Research Act. It actually got marked up and approved by the House earlier this week. And there's a companion version that was just introduced in the Senate. People recognize this aspect of the problem. We need to tell those stories about how essential research continued, and that we've been productive in it, but most research was disrupted in some way. And that has real costs, whether they're time delays, whether they have to start over, new cell lines, whatever it is. We have to continue to give those concrete examples. And I think pointing to the fact that if funding doesn't come, we literally have to put a little fear in folks, fear in folks to show that if you don't do this, two things can happen, right? You're going to lose the investment that has already been made in existing research in people, because we're not going to be able to complete those research projects if, at scale, because agencies will choose between funding these existing projects or new awards without additional funding. So you can't complete everything under that. There just simply is too much that goes on there, right? So we'll lose that return on investment that we've already made. So that's a really critical part of it. And I think the other part of this is the fear that we need more science. That's what's going to address so many of our national challenges, is making it clear that if we don't get that return on investment and we have to continue just to backstop this, we won't make the progress we need, again, to be the economic innovation and economic leader that we need to be as we move forward as a country. So shoring up what we can so we can build on that foundation that will bolster recovery and strength for years to come. That is something that I think members of Congress, other policymakers, is resonating with them. It's this notion of we also, as we shore that up, we know how better after being through this pandemic and working way through it. So we're going to be more resilient in the future as a research enterprise. That's really critical part of how we can restore and recover research for the future. And again, that, as you can see, that kind of fits under a frame for, especially when talking with Democratic members, how we do build back better in an effective way in our recovery. So I think I'll stop there, and I think we wanted to open it up for questions.
Hi, thanks so much, both of you. That was such a good summary. I already see the first question in the chat, so from Hannah Dooley, so we'll start there. She asked, which aspects of the RISE Act, in your opinion, are the most or least supported or politically viable at this point in time?
So the RISE Act is interesting. Again, it's a bit, I don't want to say simple, because sometimes it has negative connotation. It's concise. It really asks for what we think is necessary for the research agencies. And you can see from the results of the Recovery Act that was just signed today that NSF and NIH got a little bit of a shout out already. So you can see that there are some agencies that probably have a bit more political support. But I think that the RISE Act still is very important in all the agencies, and important to certain members of Congress as well who co-signed onto it, who recognize that there's an importance to supporting researchers and agencies in their districts and in their states. So I think that there's still a general support for the entire bill, and trying to get it then into actual dollars, that's the hard part.
Yeah, I think I'd just add on that very simply that, the RISE Act, again, it's an authorization bill. So it's really saying, hey, here are the numbers after it tells you all the problems that money is meant to address for each of these agencies. And so the good news is it's not overly prescriptive. The idea is to put the new funds to the agency so they can exercise their professional, judgments about how do we best support the researchers and the research that they're already funding to, again, help them recover. So it's hard to say, oh, this provision's good, this provision's bad. It's designed in such a way that maximum flexibility with the dollars will be available. And that's frankly part of the beauty of it.
So let's see, I'm gonna invite anyone who has a question to unmute their line. And I'm gonna mute my line because there's a lot of fire trucks right here.
Wendy actually has a hand up.
Yeah, so hi guys, and thank you so very much for being with us. To give a little context to our members and why we asked Matt and Bethany to be with us, our Advocacy Day, which I hope you're all signing up for, at the end of April is actually brilliantly timed, and we can take no credit for knowing the timing at the time, but when we get to the end of April, we will be past this current COVID relief bill, but we might be confronted with another one, or appropriations, or NSF reauthorization, or any number of bills that could serve as potential vehicles for the RISE Act. So depending on how things land, this could be among your asks when you're meeting with your members of Congress, either to co-sponsor the bill or to vote yes on it if it's gotten to that point or whatever. So I wanted to provide that, but then I wanted to ask our speakers, if you're one of our members sitting home, you know, in a state and at a university, they might be thinking, the RISE Act has been around for almost a year. Why hasn't it made its way into these other COVID packages that we've seen along the way? So could you just explain sort of the difference of where we've been over the last year and why the calculus may have changed?
Oh my goodness, wow, what a great question. I think that a lot of the political calculus in the last year was related to immediate needs for the public of the United States. So you may, when you read the news about the CARES Act or all the other iterations of it in the past year, you know, it's talking about direct payments, like the check that you're actually going to get, making sure that we appropriately fund unemployment, making sure that our K through 12 system and education systems are taken care of, making sure we properly fund what's necessary to get a vaccine out at record time. So lots has been necessary to make sure that we can get back outside. And the conversation about research relief, I think, can often get into people's heads as they've always been. Like our usual advocates and champions on the Hill are always concerned about the whole innovation ecosystem. And I think that it can get diluted a bit in these other conversations that are so important about innovation that we have on the Hill, that when we talk about research relief, it's like, okay, wait, just wait. We'll talk about what your needs are as soon as we get the checks out to citizens, you know? So I think there's a lot of just holding and waiting, and man, we're ready to fight though. Matt?
Yeah, no, Bethany, I think summed it up well. I mean, listen, Congress these days, and has been for some time, they respond to the fires, right? And you heard my comments earlier. I was saying this is a little bit of a slow burn. And again, we got something so critically important so early, and that was those administrative flexibilities. So the agencies weren't going, oh gosh, what do we do? They gave our institutions everything they needed to say, you know what, you can continue to pay. That was absolutely critical. So they helped us solve the problem in the administration through OMB and OSTP, and Congress going, yes, please do that. Those were literally conversations that were happening in March and April last year, so we got that flexibility. So when you put out that fire, even though it's you know, that's immediate and it's not big, it's still smoldering and we get it. And it has been every conversation since, every piece of legislation. How do we meet the immediate needs, to Bethany's point, that are out there? And this one's building and building and building. And I will tell you, we were very close last year in the fall, again, politics were the politics, of being part of the next package, or that would have been the CCRSA, the package that was approved earlier, right? We were very close to be included in that. But you saw the total number for the bill kept going down and down and down. And that made even more pressure on the immediate. So then fast forward to this package we have right now. It was a rescue bill. Again, we don't need rescuing in its conventional sense of the word, right? But we sure as heck need to have this, you know, shored up. And again, this is where the opportunity recovery be so important, because this problem only gets magnified every month. It gets further and further and further. And we know, okay, that project is not going to be completed on time. We're going to run out of funds, and those cost extension requests are going to come into the agencies. And frankly, that's going to happen over time. And that's where we can, I think, be part of this Recovery Act if we continue to put our momentum behind it.
Well, I want to thank you both for your work on this, both on behalf of COSSA and the research community, but also on behalf of my little brother, who is a PhD student in neuroscience, who we anticipated a family trip to Houston in the spring to watch him get his
little brother to tweet using hashtag RiseAct about his story. We do use social media and try to contact graduate students as we see. As a graduate student myself, I can't even imagine, well, how many decades ago, but I can't even imagine the mental impact of just this plus graduate school. So we would love to know more about how everybody's doing.
Absolutely. So thank you both, and I'm gonna pull my screen back up and run through our homework.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Someone let me know if I've shared the wrong screen, but I'm gonna proceed as if it's the right one. Okay, so as I've mentioned before, we always like to end with a couple of things that you can do this month to support social science. So as Bethany and Matt were just saying, actually, if you have a story about how your research has been affected, if you're like my younger brother, stuck in grad school and not sure how you're gonna get out, tweet your story at them, use the hashtag RiseAct, and we'll try to compile everybody's stories and make the case to Congress for the RiseAct. So homework part 1. Homework part 2, register for Advocacy Day. We just opened registration to all COSSA members this week. It's $25. It's really a fun way to interact with your congressional officials, with fellow researchers in your state. If you've never met with a member of Congress, with congressional office before, we have 2 weeks of training leading up to Advocacy Day. We give you all the materials, we schedule your meetings. It's a really good way to learn how to advocate to your elected officials. So again, we're limiting the slots because we made registration so cheap, so we can't just take everybody who could possibly do it. So register sooner. And then I wanted to just remind everybody again about that NIH Unite RFI to support diversity, equity, inclusion in the biomedical research workforce, and also research on health disparities. Sorry about the fire trucks. So the deadline for that is April 9th, and the link to respond is on the screen. You can mark your calendars for April 8th. That's when we'll be back with a new deep dive and April headlines. And as always, send your colleagues info on how to sign up for these headlines webinars on member messages. You can just email me, and encourage your colleagues at other organizations to join COSSA, especially if they'd like to participate in Advocacy Day. We do limit that to only COSSA members. It's one of the few things that you can't get around with with COSSA. We like to make everything available as much as we can, but Advocacy Day is for our members. And so if you've got colleagues who you think would be really good advocates, suggest that their institution join COSSA. And let us know if you have, if you need any directions with that. And as always, send us if you'd like us to do a deep dive on something specific. You can email Ben. His email's on the screen. All of these are archived, and you can always check back in if you want to review something you heard on a past headlines. Just a quick list of what we've covered over the past year-ish. And you can just see like pre-COVID and then COVID. So it's a interesting snapshot of the year that we've all had. So with that, I'm gonna leave it here. My contact info is on the screen if you have any questions for me. And with that, thank you, and we'll see you next month.